Yeah,
Has
terrific
slug
word,
a bed.
yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Let's go to Wichita, Kansas first. Go ahead.
Yes, hi, Dr. Baker. Thank you for taking my call. My question was regarding metaphorical concepts that you use. And you mentioned, for example, an old paradigm we had about the mind being a blank slate, or a fairly contemporary one, such as the mind being a processing machine. What is the particular challenge of finding the right metaphorical concepts in your field, and do you have one that you're somewhat privy to right now that you prefer as for example, you mentioned the language as a window into human nature. That's my question. Thank you.
Yes. There is a discussion in the book on why metaphors are so common in science, the realm of discourse in which we feel we have the surest route to truth. And there's a big difference between the use of metaphor in poetry and everyday conversation on the one hand, and science on the other, which is in science you always have to be mindful of which aspects of the metaphor or analogy you take seriously, and which are just ornamentation or flesh on the skeleton that just, to use two more metaphors, that get in the way of understanding. And often, when a metaphor is introduced in science, there will be some misunderstandings and some debate and subsequent clarification as to what aspects of the metaphor ought to be taken seriously. I'll give two examples. The Selfish Gene, the book that I alluded to in the intermission. No one should believe or can believe that DNA actually has motives or consciousness or intentions in the same way that a human brain has intentions and consciousness. Nonetheless, the metaphor is useful in the sense that the genes will be selected for effects that replicate copies of that gene. So that's a kernel of meaning shared by selfishness as we apply it to people, and selfishness as Richard Dawkins applied it to genes. And as long as you focus on that common core of meaning and don't get distracted by things like conscious intentions, it can continue to be useful. Another one is the brain as a computer, which was popular in the 1960s in my own field, in cognitive psychology, where again there can be a lot of misleading aspects to that if you took it too seriously. The idea that the brain follows discrete rules, the way a computer follows steps in a program. The idea that the brain does things one at a time in serial order as opposed to massively parallel fashion. Those could certainly be misleading. On the other hand, there probably is, in fact, I would argue that, in fact, there is a common thread that applies both to the explanation of what makes brains intelligent and the explanation of what makes computers intelligent, and that would be some kind of information processing. So, in my current concerns, one auxiliary metaphor that I used in the stuff of thought was that language is not just a window into human nature, but a fistula, that is a gaping hole in a tissue. And that's because one of the reasons that we're often so circumspect about using language, we don't just blurt out what we mean, but we often veil our intentions in innuendo and euphemism and doublespeak, is because using language directly can reveal too much about ourselves, and we often have to take self-protective measures to prevent infection, as one is vulnerable to if one has a fistula, an open wound. And so language has not just the positive connotations of revealing the workings of the mind, but the possible dangerous connotations of allowing us to be infected by information that we get.
Well, here's an emailer who wants to talk about the whole issue of not saying necessarily what we mean because of politeness. And they said that the response to thank you in today has changed from "you're welcome" to "no problem."
No problem, yes.
Yeah. The person says, "I much prefer the first because it seems to be a more gracious response than the second, which seems dismissive." Will you talk a little bit about the various automatic politenesses that we have?
Yes, there's a whole range of expressions that we use without thinking too much about what they literally mean, such as "you're welcome." I don't even know if, even prior to this conversation, I ever thought about what it means to say "you're welcome." I guess it means it's no imposition, feel free to ask for something similar again in the future. No problem, of course, means it is, I am not putting myself, or I don't mind the fact that I have been putting myself out to accede to your request because I like you so much that what ordinarily would be a problem is not one in this case if I can help you. Now, we don't really think through the literal content. They become formulas that you have to learn when you learn a native language. One of the first things that you learn when you go to some other country, even if you know nothing else about Italian, you learn how to say, please, thank you, excuse me. Yeah, excuse me is a little odd, too, when you think about it, especially when you go up to a stranger and you say, excuse me, do you know the time? You're asking for forgiveness before you even,
Right.
as if the mere asking of the question is some kind of injury for which you need forgiveness. Now, we don't think about these, but we absolutely depend on them in order to be conversational speakers. And that's one category of politeness. The other category that I'm more interested in my own research is when we compose the request for the occasion. Sometimes it's called off-record indirect speech as opposed to on-record. On-record indirect speech is, please, thank you, you're welcome, can you pass the salt, do you know the time? Each of which, when you think about it, is a little odd in terms of its literal content, but it's a move in a game that we all know what to make. An off-record indirect speech act would be something like, gee, I have a really nice view from my balcony, would you like to come up for coffee at the end of a date? Which can be interpreted as a sexual come-on. There, it's not a formula that you memorize, but both the speaker and the hearer have to do a little minuet figuring out what's really going on. And those are two different kinds of politeness. There's a third kind where you use false terms of affiliation or even kinship. Hey, brother, or buddy, or use of in-group slang, you lend me a couple of bucks, where you impose a kind of spurious friendship or camaraderie in approaching someone. Those are just three of the many kinds of politeness that linguists have tried to analyze.
Santa Fe, New Mexico, hello.
Hi, Dr. Singer. First of all, I just wanted to say how much I really enjoyed your book, The Stuff of Thought.
Oh, thank you.
And in particular, a question came to mind in the chapter of what's in a name. This is a concept, the power of a name is a concept that's been around, especially in sci-fi fantasy, for a long time with Ursula Le Guin and stuff. And you talked about it as particularly proper names as the way we refer to an individual in every conceivable circumstance. And I was curious as to what your thoughts are on how names have played a role in our current political situation.
You mean, for example, Barack Hussein Obama?
Exactly.
Yes.
And the more acceptable, conservative, Christian-based name of John.
Oh, yes. Well, these are examples of how people don't intuitively conform to the linguist's idea that a name is an arbitrary label. That's one of the first things you learn in linguistics, that a sound can be anything as long as it's consistently used to refer to its referent. But people don't buy it intuitively. Swearing is an example where we think that the moral order is threatened by merely uttering a word, even though using a polite synonym refers to the same thing, but we feel that there's some huge moral difference between them. Prayer is another example of what's sometimes called word magic. That is, thinking that words are actually lawfully connected to the thing they stand for. It's almost as if it's one of your essential traits, as opposed to a label that your mom just gave you when you were born. In the case of Barack Obama, the fact that his middle name is Hussein, widespread throughout not just the Arab world, but in Africa, where his father came from, and I believe it was the name of his paternal grandfather, people, no matter how many times they're told, can't shake off this intuition that Obama is a Muslim because he has a name that's traditionally associated with many Muslims. And I think even people who would not credit it if they thought it through allow themselves to be infected by that feeling, well, maybe deep down he is sympathetic to the Arab world, despite his repeated, heartfelt, sincere declarations of solidarity with Israel. He might favor the Arabs because of that middle name. Now, it makes no sense. A name is just, what's in a name, as Shakespeare said, but I think it's part of that psychological phenomenon of word magic, that we think that the person's essence is revealed through his name.